He thought he had caught the culprit until the criminal revealed that he was one of the most influential prosecutors in the country. What happened next? Stay until the end to discover a fascinating story of prejudice, consequences, and redemption. In the meantime, tell us where you are watching this unfold. The hurried footsteps echoed through the cold, concrete walls of the parking lot behind the court. Inspector Velasquez gripped the transmitter of his radio tightly and shouted firmly, "I have the suspect. He fits the description perfectly." His words were direct and full of confidence. A quick glance at the man he had detained showed a tall, dark-skinned individual wearing a perfectly fitted navy blue suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Velasquez tightened his grip on the detainee's arm even further, despite there being no resistance. The man looked at him calmly, his penetrating eyes unwavering. "You're making a mistake," he said in a low but firm voice. Velasquez let out a mocking laugh and glanced at his nearby colleague, who looked confused. "Yes, well, it's not for you to decide. We'll let the court determine that." The background of the case was a series of minor robberies in the city center. The description was simple. A dark-skinned man, tall, around 40 years old. That was all Velasquez needed. The impeccable appearance and determined posture of the man didn't seem to register in his mind. To him, it was just another criminal trying to evade justice. The journey to the court was tense. Velasquez kept his hand on the holster of his gun, as though expecting the man to attempt an escape. But the detainee did no such thing. He stood tall, calm, and unperturbed, his eyes observing the crowded streets without a hint of fear or anger. Inside the court, the air was charged with anticipation. Attendees settled into their seats while the inspector led the detainee to the stand. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd gathered for the day's hearings. "It seems he's caught another one," someone whispered. The man, however, showed no signs of concern. He bowed slightly towards Velasquez as they approached the judge. "You're going to regret this," he said softly, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. Velasquez smirked with disdain. "We'll see." When the man finally prepared to speak before the court, his confident bearing and firm gaze made it clear this would not be an ordinary case. The courtroom was buzzing with murmurs. Velasquez stood tall, chest puffed out, as if he had made the most important arrest of the year. The accused, on the other hand, remained silent, his briefcase still in hand, his polished shoes reflecting the cold ceiling lights. The magistrate, an older man with a weary expression, reviewed some documents before addressing Velasquez. "Inspector, please state your case." Velasquez cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Your Honor, this individual perfectly matches the description provided by several witnesses in relation to a series of robberies in the city center last week. A dark-skinned man, around 40 years old. He's a perfect match." His voice brimmed with confidence, but it carried an unnecessary weight, as though he were trying to convince himself as much as the court. The magistrate raised an eyebrow and turned to the accused. "Sir, would you please state your name for the record?" The man set his briefcase down, adjusted his tie, and exuded an air of authority. "My name is Victor Blackwell. I am a federal prosecutor in the Department of Justice." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The weight of his words struck everyone present. Velasquez's confident smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Your Honor, I do not see how his occupation is relevant to the charges." Victor Blackwell's piercing gaze fixed on Velasquez. "It is relevant because it highlights the recklessness of this inspector's actions. He arrested me without justification, based solely on a vague description and nothing more." The tension in the room was palpable. Blackwell's words were calm, yet carried a gravity that demanded attention. "Do you know how often men who look like me are detained, questioned, or arrested based on nothing but a vague description?" Blackwell continued. "I have dedicated my career to fighting for justice, Inspector, and what you did today is the very opposite of that." The magistrate raised a hand to calm the growing tension. "That's enough," he said firmly, though his voice betrayed a hint of curiosity. He turned back to Blackwell. "Mr. Blackwell, I will give you the opportunity to continue, but please be brief." Blackwell nodded and took a step forward, his presence filling the room. "Your Honor, this incident is not just a case of mistaken identity. It is a reflection of the structural problems in our judicial system. When assumptions replace evidence, when prejudice overrides judgment, Innocent people are the ones who pay the price. The silence in the courtroom was heavy. Even those who had initially dismissed the case as trivial now sat on the edge of their seats. Velázquez's once confident demeanor was replaced with hesitation, his defiant stance shifting into a defensive posture. Blackwell adjusted his tie and addressed Velázquez directly. "Inspector, you said the description came from several witnesses. Could you share with the court exactly what those witnesses reported?" Velázquez hesitated, glancing at his notes. "Dark-skinned man, about 40 years old, wearing a dark jacket," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Blackwell raised an eyebrow. "That's it? Nothing about distinctive features, behavior, or even specific details of clothing? Just a vague description that could fit hundreds of men in this city?" Velázquez's silence spoke volumes. The tension in the room grew as Blackwell turned to the magistrate. "Your Honor, this is the problem. Vague descriptions lead to vague surveillance. Instead of investigating, officers make impulsive decisions that disproportionately affect dark-skinned men." The magistrate's expression remained stoic, though his fingers drummed thoughtfully on the stand. "Mr. Blackwell, are you suggesting that this is a systemic issue and not just an isolated case?" Blackwell's voice was resolute. "I am not suggesting it, Your Honor. I am stating it as fact." "I state it with all certainty," Blackwell replied, turning to the court and addressing everyone. "I have observed this pattern time and again. Young people detained just for being in the wrong place, parents handcuffed in front of their children because someone thought they had something to hide. How many of these cases reach the courts? How many lives are interrupted or destroyed by hasty assumptions?" Inspector Velázquez shifted uneasily, his confidence now completely replaced by discomfort. Blackwell was not only defending himself, but dismantling the very foundation upon which the inspector's actions were based. Blackwell turned to him once more. "You knew I was a federal prosecutor when I was arrested, didn't you?" Velázquez's face flushed. No, I didn't know." "Exactly." Blackwell's voice was calm but as sharp as a blade. "Because you didn't ask. You didn't verify. You didn't check your assumptions. You acted on impulse. And that impulse had nothing to do with justice, but with prejudice." The courtroom fell into absolute silence, broken only by the faint rustle of someone shifting in the gallery. Blackwell let the silence linger before continuing, this time addressing the magistrate directly. "Your Honor, I did not seek to punish this inspector. I sought accountability because if this can happen to me, a federal prosecutor, it can happen to anyone." The magistrate leaned forward, clearly pondering his next words. But as he leaned back in his chair, his penetrating gaze fixed on Inspector Velázquez, it was clear the moment would not end in silence. "Inspector Velázquez," the magistrate began, his tone firm but measured, "do you have anything further to add in your defense?" Velázquez swallowed hard, the confidence that had once fueled his posture now entirely drained. "Your Honor, I was only following protocol. I didn't want to violate protocol." Blackwell cut in sharply, his voice slicing through Velázquez's stammering. "If this is what you consider protocol, then it is time to question the very protocols you claim to follow." The magistrate raised a hand toward Blackwell, signaling him to stop. "Mr. Blackwell, let him finish." Velázquez glanced at the magistrate, then at Blackwell, his words faltering. "I thought I was doing my job. I didn't want to unfairly accuse anyone." Slowly, Blackwell's expression softened, though his tone remained firm. "That's the problem, Inspector Velázquez. Prejudice doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as instinct, as just doing your job. But the consequences are real, and they are devastating." The courtroom remained still, the weight of Blackwell's words sinking in. Turning once more to the gallery, he spoke, not just to them, but to anyone who would ever hear this story. "I have dedicated my career to fighting for a system that works for everyone, not just for those who look a certain way or live in certain neighborhoods. But no system can fix what we refuse to recognize." The magistrate cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwell has made his point. What do you suggest as a resolution to this matter?" Blackwell hesitated for a moment, carefully choosing his next words. "Your Honor, I don't believe in revenge, but I do believe in responsibility." This inspector needs to understand the damage his actions caused, not only to me, but to the integrity of the system he represents." Velasquez blushed but didn't argue. He looked down at his hands, the reality of the situation sinking in. Victor continued, his voice resolute. "Let this be a turning point, not only for Inspector Velasquez, but for everyone in this room. If we do not confront the prejudices we carry, they will continue to poison the very foundation of justice." As the judge prepared to deliver his verdict, the tension in the room shifted, signaling a conclusion that would leave no one unchanged. The judge let out a slow sigh, his gavel resting lightly in his hand. He scanned the room, his gaze pausing on Victor, then on Velasquez, and finally on the crowd. "This case is not just about an improper arrest," he began, his voice firm but reflective. "It is about the principles we must defend in this courtroom and in our society." He turned to Velasquez, who was now staring at the floor. "Officer Velasquez, your actions today demonstrate a worrying lack of judgment. Although you may have believed you were acting in accordance with the law, your failure to gather sufficient evidence and your reliance on vague descriptions show a lack of respect for due process." Velasquez nodded slightly, lips pursed, but remained silent. The judge shifted his focus to Blackwell. "Mr. Blackwell, your composure and ability to articulate the deeper issues at stake are commendable. However, I am no stranger to the anger and frustration situations like this can cause. You have turned what could have been a moment of personal outrage into an opportunity for collective reflection." Blackwell bowed his head, a subtle acknowledgement of the judge's remarks. The judge leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Velasquez. "I am ordering you to attend compulsory training on implicit bias and community involvement, as well as to issue a formal written apology to Mr. Blackwell. In addition, I request that the police department review its protocols for detaining suspects based solely on vague descriptions." The decision caused a murmur in the courtroom. Some exchanged glances, while others nodded silently, as though the ruling reflected a long-awaited reckoning. Velasquez looked up at Blackwell, his expression a mixture of regret and defeat. "I'm sorry," he said in a low voice. It wasn't eloquent, but there was sincerity in his tone. Victor didn't reply immediately. He watched the officer for a moment, then nodded briefly. "I hope this is a lesson that leads to real change, for you and for the system you serve." As the courtroom began to empty, Victor remained standing, his imposing presence lingering in the room. A reporter approached him with a microphone in hand. "Mr. Blackwell, do you have any comments on today's outcome?" Victor looked directly into the camera, his voice firm and clear. "Justice is not a destination, it's a journey, and that journey requires all of us to challenge the systems and prejudices that hold us back. We cannot afford to look the other way. We must be better." The reporter lowered the microphone as Victor turned to leave, his briefcase in hand. Outside the courthouse, sunlight bathed the steps as he walked. The weight of the day's events was evident, but not overwhelming. He knew this was not the end. It was a small step toward something bigger. Even as an officer had faced accountability today, Victor understood that the fight for justice was far from over. As he descended the courthouse steps, a small crowd had gathered. Some nodded in silent respect, while others whispered among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Victor paused, looking at the bustling city streets. Life carried on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But he knew that wasn't true. Change, no matter how small, begins with moments like these. It's not about grand speeches or radical reforms, but about holding people accountable and forcing systems to confront their flaws, one case at a time. Today was a victory, but it was only the beginning of a much longer road. He turned to the cameras still stationed on the courthouse lawn, addressing them and anyone who might hear his words. Responsibility is not just about an officer, a court, or a single case. It's about all of us. It's about asking ourselves the hard questions, refusing to accept excuses, and demanding better. For everyone. His voice carried a quiet strength, the kind that lingers long after the words have been spoken. With that, he adjusted his grip on his briefcase, a weight that felt lighter compared to the moment he had created. For those watching this video, he continued, ask yourself what prejudices you carry, what assumptions you've made without realizing it. Justice begins when we challenge ourselves and others to be better. If this story resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Talk about it. Let it inspire action. And if you believe in the power of stories to create change, join us on this journey. Together, we can start conversations that matter. It doesn't happen by accident. It's a choice we make every day.